Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 48 of my 2021 reads. This week I read a couple of different things, including one book that I have been meaning to get to for the past 6 or 7 years, which made me so happy, and I did DNF a book that just didn't work out for me. Timestamps and content warnings are in the description box below. The first book I finished this week was The Scurlock Studio and Black Washington, Picturing the Promise by the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is a nonfiction sort of photo book. It is a really neat collection of different photos that were produced by the Scurlock Studio, which was a Black family-owned photography studio that ran in Washington, D.C. throughout most of the 20th century, although their kind of heyday was the first half of the 20th century. And so this book is just showing a bunch of the different photos that they took, and a lot of different people, especially historians, writing essays about what these photos represented, why this was so important, and kind of providing a view into what life was like in Washington, D.C. in the first half of the 20th century. This book actually was so cool. One, I love photo books, and the photos in this were just spectacular. I loved the style of the Scurlock photos. They just did a lot of portraiture, showing a lot of both famous as well as just everyday people, really beautiful, kind of glamorous photos almost, as well as photos of a lot of the things around them. They especially focused a lot on kind of Black-owned businesses and Black social life, as well as Howard University. So they were the official photographers for Howard University, and so they've got a lot of photos of that, and it was just really neat looking at all these photos as well as reading the essays. These essays, I thought, did such a good job of exploring kind of what the Scurlock family was doing in their photography, as well as the different kind of ideas and politics of the day. So the Scurlocks had this idea of kind of a little bit of respectability politics, this idea of the talented 10th, this idea of saying we're going to portray Black culture and beauty and wisdom and glamour and all of these, kind of middle class people and values, and really show how wonderful our community is, while they didn't necessarily acknowledge some of the poverty, some of the issues that were going on in their community. They kind of did this rosy colored glasses type of view of society. And I liked how the historians in this did a very nuanced exploration of that, explaining why they might have wanted to take that view, and also why that view was limited. And I just thought that discussion was excellent. I think at times some of the essays were a little bit on the academic side, but most of them were just so readable, and it was really lovely reading about a lot of the different big events that happened in DC. And I mean, you've got stuff like Martin Luther King Jr., who came to speak at Howard University, and you've also just got a lot of people who were kind of big movers and shakers of that time. So really cool. I really definitely loved this collection. Very glad that I picked it up, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. And someday when I can get to DC again, I definitely want to go to this museum, the National Museum for African American History and Culture, because that's a new museum. It only opened up a couple of years ago, so I definitely want to check that out. The next book that I read was Someone to Cherish by Mary Balogh. This is book 7 or 8 in her Westcott Regency romance series. I have read all of the previous books. Mary Balogh is one of my favorite Regency authors. And this book follows Harry, who is somebody who fought in the Napoleonic Wars a couple of years before, and came back home very ill from that. He both kind of emotionally as well as physically was very worn out by the war. He'd been injured pretty severely, and he also had a lot of depression and PTSD from being a captain and really being in charge of the murder of many of the enemy soldiers. So he's working through a lot of that and trying to find his joy in life. And in his small little village, there happens to be a widow. She was Lydia. She was the wife of the reverend who was there for a few years, a very young, charismatic reverend who was very passionate about, God and all these sorts of things, who died young. And she is somebody who's trying to discover herself, because when growing up, she had very controlling father and brothers, and then she went straight from that to marriage, where her husband was also a very dominant personality, and she just kind of effaced herself and fell back into the shadows for so long. Now that she's been a widow for a couple of years, she's trying to figure out who she is, find her own independence. And they kind of are both lonely and decide to maybe start an affair, which is quite complicated in a small English village. So just like all of Mary Balogh's works, this book did such a great job of the two characters both working through their own kind of internal issues, as well as learning how to be vulnerable and trust each other. And I always love that. The core of Mary Balogh's works is all about personal growth and about connection. And that's just beautiful. I find that very romantic. I like it quite a lot. So I really liked their interactions, and I liked them as people. They were interesting characters. This book, though, because it is so far into the series, it suffers from a lot of info dumping. Normally romances aren't so bad on info dumping, but because we have so many previous books in this series, and because for Harry's birthday, a ton of his relatives come to the town, and we get the backstories of all of their romances and lives and everything like that. We basically get 10% of this book dedicated to summarizing the previous books in the series, which I found very tedious. I do not like info dumping at all, so I didn't like that. And another thing that Mary Balogh does tend to do sometimes, but really stood out to me in this book, was monologuing. She often has her characters sort of come to epiphanies about life and about love and these sorts of things, and she does tend to have the monologue, but the monologuing felt really excessive to me in this. And I haven't read a Mary Balogh book for a couple of years, so I wonder if I go back and read some of her other stuff if I'll find it a little bit monologue-y. But yeah, it's not that I disagree with what the characters are saying, but there's just quite a lot of monologuing. So overall, I did like the core romance of this. It was just very enjoyable. I read this in just 2 days. It was very, very easy to read through as well. But that info dumping and the monologuing, not so much a fan of. So I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I'm sure I will continue to read the series and anything else that Mary Balogh puts out. Then I read The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin, which is the first book in her Inheritance trilogy. This is a book that I have been meaning to read for so many years, 6 or 7 years. Sush read it, and we've had it on ebook, and I've been meaning to read it. And finally, I have some Goodreads friends, Leticia and Karen, who said, hey, let's buddy read this. And they even waited for me to finish up all of my Hugo readings so that I had time. And so we buddy read this, and I was so glad that I finally got to this. N.K. Jemisin is just such a fantastic author. She has such creativity when it comes to world building, when it comes to characters, when it comes to plot, and this book really, really shows it. So this book takes place in this fantasy kingdom where basically there used to be 3 gods, kind of a god of the day, a god of the night, and a goddess of the twilight and dawn. And they lived for a very, very, very long time, just the 3 of them. And then the goddess of the twilight and dawn basically had created humanity and things like that, and also there started to be quite a few demigods and all these sorts of things. And there was a war that broke out between the different gods because the god of the day was pretty upset at the other 2. And the goddess of the dawn and twilight was killed, and the god of the night was enslaved. And so now we come into this world where everybody worships the god of the day, and his sort of people, in a sense, are dominant over the land, and they're starting to have a succession. So the current emperor king guy is getting old, and he's going to pass away, and there needs to be a successor chosen. And one of his granddaughters is called in as a potential successor, even though her mother kind of got disowned because she married somebody outside of this group of the chosen into sort of a barbarian land. And so she's brought into this place, this palace filled with court intrigue and filled with magic, because the people can use the magic of the gods if they are like kind of the chosen people. So we've got so much really intricate court politics. We've got really interesting character dynamics, and the narrative structure of this is so interesting because it's told from this granddaughter's perspective, and she is sort of telling it from the future, but reflecting on the whole journey of her coming to the palace and everything. And so we get little hints of what's going to happen. She goes on tangents constantly and sometimes remembers, oh yeah, I should have told you about this other thing. So she's a little bit of an unreliable narrator in that sense. I loved the narration style. It was just so fantastic. This book is one that just draws you in, and it's just so well fleshed out in terms of the way that the characters and the politics and the world work. So I thought that this was just really, really well done. It is, however, a little bit icky in some senses. So it's got some weird sex stuff in it. And Jemisin does tend to have weird sex stuff. So that's not a terrible surprise, but just some stuff about, because the gods sort of existed by themselves for a long time, there's quite a bit of like incest among the gods. Although, I mean, they are gods, not humans, but still, incest is kind of icky. And then also just some like non-consensual sex, and sex that involves slavery, and sex that involves kind of hurting people and those sorts of things. So some weird sex stuff. And then also there's a bit of violence, especially torture. There's some torture in this that was just really unpleasant to read through. And I never like reading violence. So those two things just weren't so much for me, but the story as a whole was just really, really well done. And I'm definitely planning to go ahead and continue and finish off the trilogy, maybe this year, but maybe next year. We'll just have to see what my mood is. This book I gave 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I definitely recommend picking this up if you like fantasy. Then I did DNF one book this week, which was This Green and Pleasant Land by Ayisha Malik. So this book I was really looking forward to. I'd heard about it, I liked the premise, I had gotten my library to order a copy, I'd borrowed that copy, hadn't gotten to it, renewed it 5 times, my library is very generous, and finally I was like, oh, this is due in a week, I need to pick it up, and then I didn't like it. I felt so bad. Like, this is one that I have been really looking forward to, and I went through all this trouble, and I just was not into it. I read 1 chapter, 6% of the book, and then I DNF'd it because I just was not into it. And I wasn't into this from like the 2nd page. And I don't even know how to explain why I wasn't into it. I just wasn't into it. Basically, the premise of this story is that it's a contemporary that takes place in a small British village, and we follow a Pakistani British man who's middle-aged, whose mother passes away from cancer, and her last dying wish is for him to build a mosque in his little British village. And so this is kind of, a really interesting premise, but I just was not into the story. And the writing was fine, but I just didn't enjoy it. It just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I think part of it is just that this main character, this middle-aged guy, is somebody who is very much a doormat. Like, people walk all over him, and he's just very unhappy, and he has a lot of anxiety, and he's got like ulcers from his stress and things like that. His relatives kind of take advantage of him. He's got a wife who doesn't respect him at all, seems to barely tolerate him, and is probably having an affair with her ex-husband. And I know that the story is probably going to be about him finding himself and finding meaning and purpose and self, that kind of self-power. And I do like empowerment stories, but I just did not like the beginning of this book. So I'm not sure why I didn't like this, and I would not at all recommend against picking up this book, because I can't even put into words. I just don't know why I didn't like it. So I don't think that this is something anybody else should take my DNFing to heart with. I think probably is a perfectly good book, but I just could not get into it. Okay, that's everything that I read and DNF'd this week. If you guys have read any of these, if you want to read them, if you have any thoughts, anything at all, just leave me a comment down below.